Well, this news today from Jeff Sessions and his proposal to rescind the Cole memo is disturbing, but it's not panic time. We have already the protections baked into the continuing resolution. It's why we're working to expand the protections of my amendment and extend it to the full range of marijuana activities. Ironically, this might be the catalyst that forces Congress to actually solve the ambiguity. The American public and more than 2/3 of the states are way ahead of the federal government, and this might help us be able to get the reforms necessary to make threats like this unnecessary and impossible in the future.
When you say baked in, that you can't do anything.
Well, what we've done, we have an amendment with my colleague Dana Rohrabacher that has put in protections for medical marijuana from interference from the federal government, and that continues with the continuing resolution. It has support in both the House and the Senate, unprecedented support. So if we ever get into the budget process, we're confident that we'll be able to extend it. Now, it's important that it goes beyond medical marijuana because we now have 9 states, including Oregon, where the public has determined that there will be adult use, and there's more in the pipeline. It's interesting that for the first time in history now, a majority of Republicans and Democrats agree that this is a policy that needs to be protected. So I think the stage is set. It's ironic that Mr. Sessions appears to directly contradict the statement that then candidate Trump stated in a direct question in Colorado last year, that he would let the states go ahead. He doesn't want to interfere with it. It raises a question again about the discrepancy between Sessions and Trump. It'll be interesting how they resolve that.
Why do you think Sessions keeps going after this? He has something wrong with that.
You know, I think he's frozen in time. I mean, I think that is his mindset. It's a very punitive approach. It is something that they couldn't even enforce in his home state of Alabama. And I've had these conversations there. People think in 14 seconds a junior high student can get marijuana in Alabama. We watched in a neighboring state where there was a vote in Arkansas to extend medical marijuana. I mean, he's just out of step. It's part of a punitive approach that he has been advocating dealing with drug policies, not treatment, not more compassionate and thoughtful approach, but a very punitive one that has failed. But I think he's trapped in time. The good news is that a majority of Americans repudiate it. We have more and more support in Congress. We've been in touch with our friends in the Senate and the Cannabis Caucus. And as I say, this might just be the kick in the pants to help resolve these ambiguities in terms of policy to get this solved once and for all.
What's the message that you would like, say, a cannabis business owner to take away from this news today?
Well, I mean, as I said, people should be concerned but not panicked. We're winning this battle. The American public is adding momentum on an ongoing basis. People are voting at the ballot box. They're voting at the marketplace. If we all do our job, I think we can use this as a catalyst to end this ambiguity. We've got bipartisan support to end the prohibition for research for cannabis. We have bipartisan support to deal with the banking problems. We have bipartisan support for fair taxation for this industry. And I think this is might be, as I say, the catalyst that helps us drag this across the finish line. We've had steady progress for 5 years now, building momentum. Mr. Sessions is out of touch with that, and I think that it's important for people who support this reform to renew their efforts, because it's making a difference in states around the country. We see it in the support for men and women in Congress in both parties, in both the House and the Senate. And I think we need to redouble those efforts. Say again, please. Well, the amendment that we've been successful with so far makes it impossible to use federal funds to interfere with state legal medical marijuana. And what we want to do is extend it past medical marijuana to state legal adult use and not go from budget to budget, but try and make it a permanent protection, which is what most members of Congress support and where the public is. Well, if we're unable to make it permanent, we'll continue fighting as we have to extend it with each budget process. We have, as I mentioned, more support for that. It's in the continuing resolution. It's in the Senate version of the budget. It's not ideal, but we've lived with it. And ultimately we're going to win, but I hope that we don't have to put people through this uncertainty.
Have you talked to the U.S. Attorney's Office, or do you plan to, about how they intend to approach this?
You know, I think it's better to not put them in the crossfire between what's going on here and what Mr. Sessions has announced. As I mentioned, that's at variance with what Donald Trump said very explicitly, that anybody can go on YouTube and listen to his own words to themselves. But I don't think it's a good idea to get the 93 U.S. attorneys, most of whom are acting now, crosswise with Mr. Sessions.
Are you surprised at all by the timing of this, considering it's 3 days after the biggest state in the country legalizes recreational?
It is concerning, and it just sort of illustrates how out of touch. I mean, this is the most significant addition to the marijuana market. It's second. The Florida medical marijuana is huge, but California, this is a game changer. It's a signal that this multi-billion-dollar industry, so strongly supported by the American public, has fully gone mainstream, and it underscores work that's going on in other states. So the timing is jaw-dropping.
Nothing, I presume, is going to really change this afternoon or even in a week, but 6 months from now, if the ambiguity continues, what is the worst-case scenario for what you see here in the Pacific Northwest for how things operate now, and then what would happen with possible crackdowns or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I think that any attempt at implementing changes is going to have dramatic shock impact. We have over 20 million Americans who have legal access to marijuana and use it every month. We have over 2/3 of the population that has either medical or adult use. 9 states have both, and that momentum continues to build. So I think that Mr. Sessions is on the losing side of history. He's at variance with where the overwhelming majority of people in both parties are, and the stated policy of the president. So I really think that we're going to, the extent to which he monkeys around with it, this might be the catalyst that allows us to resolve it once and for all in a way that the American public want. This train has left the station. You know, the American public is not going to turn their back on it. And I'm quite confident that if he would persist in something of this nature, it would create a major backlash politically and practically.
And then, I know obviously different branches of government, but is there anything in the states, essentially this western wall that we have, is there anything that Kate Brown James and the like can do, you think, legally to try to stop it?
Well, there's a commitment in Oregon and Washington and California to fully, fairly, and carefully implement the law. And you saw some changes here in Oregon to try and tighten things up because there is a commitment to do it right. And I think the most important thing we can do is to work with the industry and the public to make sure the intent of what voters have approved is respected. Because if we do this right, we're going to be able to tax it, regulate it. We'll be able to, for the first time, to really keep it out of the hands of children. And we'll be able to have people receiving the benefit of a state legal and regulated market. And that's the most important thing we need to do.
So there are some very far-reaching proposals that have been put out there for essentially legalization. But do you think that Blumenauer Rohrbach is extending that to recreational is sort of the logical next step?
Well, it is a next step that we're used to in Congress, and there's support for. But Senator Wyden and I, earlier this Congress, introduced comprehensive legislation that would solve all of these. And we have, I would say conservatively, 24 pieces of legislation that deal with bits and pieces that are getting bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. I'd prefer our comprehensive legislation. If worse comes to worse, we'll fight it out with these little extensions. But ultimately, we're going to have comprehensive reform. I have been on record as saying I think it's game over in less than 5 years, and I think this today might help accelerate that timetable. American public deserves it. Thanks for your patience. Sorry it was a little nippy, but as I say, 20 degrees warmer than DC.
One last thing, if I could.
Yeah.
There has been talk of perhaps the western states forming sort of compacts between them where they could do interstate. Do you think that that's a viable option?
Well,
there was talk in the Oregon legislature.
Well, it's actually a whole West Coast, including British Columbia, because Canada is on track to legalize adult use, and we're seeing changes in Mexico. So this is, kind of a North American effort, but I think one step at a time. We want to make sure that we protect the integrity of the state markets and be able to look at what makes sense going forward. We have higher priorities initially in terms of being able to protect state legal markets, be able to make sure that people can pay fair taxes with a check, and break the logjam for research, because we don't really have some good tests for impairment. I mean, there are things that we can do before we start looking at massive increases. Although I think you're going to see some interesting potential for regional cannabis tourism, but you don't need to have an interstate compact for stuff like that. Sure. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.